Need a floodlight.
Everyone okay? Everyone got a seat? Everyone who's got a drink would like one? We're just setting up. It's got to the stage now where I have to use glasses. There's going to be a bit of pulling on and off. Just wanted to welcome you all here tonight to Bookmarks, and we're extremely pleased, and probably in my case a little overexcited again, to have Stuart Cosgrove here to talk about his new book, Memphis '68, The Tragedy of Southern Soul. I was lucky enough to chair an event here, I think it must have been back in 2015, for Detroit '67, and also then to DJ with Stuart at the state we're in when his paperback came out, and that was a really great night. For those of you who don't know, and I expect most of you do, but Stuart is a journalist, is a broadcaster, an ex-TV executive. As a journalist, he's worked on The Enemy and The Face during the 80s before joining Channel 4 in the 90s, becoming one of Channel 4's longest-serving members of staff, I believe.
Indeed, yes. Thank God for that pension.
Holding down a number of roles as well as serving as a controller of arts and entertainment. But Stuart's also a very, very keen soul fan as well, and a collector. And as well as his regular football show that some people may also know on BBC Radio Scotland, he also used to produce Stuart Cosgrove's Floor Fillers.
Yes.
Absolutely classic, lovely programme about Northern Soul. I'm not going to say anything about Stuart's book, I'm going to leave that entirely to him. But Stuart's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up. There'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion and debate, and then we'll come back. Stuart will sum up. You'll have an opportunity to get Stuart to sign the book for you. So can you join me in welcoming Stuart to Bookmarks tonight? Thank you. I've got to say, we're live streaming for the first time ever. It's a new experience. I think it's only coming this way. I think it's only us that are going to put on the film. But if you're feeling anxious about anything, Dave will be sitting over there, catch his eyes, and he can always make sure you're not included. But I think it's only coming to the front of the shop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. It's an absolute pleasure to be back here. You know, when you kind of publish books, there's many little kind of thrills in life, but one of the great thrills of all is seeing where the book is next to, or on whose shelf the book is in the same company of. And it's one of the most exciting things today. I came in and to see it, to be able to get a shot of it with Angela Davis in the background is just kind of immense for me. Admittedly, it was a low angle shot, but I got there.
And it's a bag.
Exactly, yes, indeed. And over there in the music section, it's Cheek by Jowl, right next to Billy Bragg's new book on the history of skiffle music. So I do feel in fantastic company, and of course here tonight with so many people who've got interest in politics, in soul music, and in the history of the 1960s. I'm sure there'll be lots of kind of thoughts and whatever. As Andrea's kind of pointed out, the book Memphis '68 is part 2 in what I hope is kind of a major kind of epic trilogy on the history of soul music in the 60s, against the backdrop of, for me, one of the most exciting decades politically ever. It's called Memphis '68, The Tragedy of Southern Soul, and it comes after Detroit '67, the year that changed soul. When I was writing Detroit '67, I'm one of these kind of inveterate list keepers, you know, that keeps a list of everything. I think it goes back probably to my origins as a young guy in the Northern Soul scene, where you simply list everything. It's a kind of almost a sort of modern autism that you're taught when you join the Northern Soul scene. Everything has to be noted down and, you know, compared with that record and this label and all the rest of it. And it ends up that it becomes almost a fetish in life. And when I was working on Detroit '67, I kept a list of what other writers said in these tips and tricks that you pick up, and that they're all off frequently in the media pages of The Guardian, but almost anywhere you go online now, it's all this kind of listomania, list culture and whatever. 52 things you must never do with plum chutney and things like that. You know, you look at them, you think 14 things you must buy this Christmas, and I was kind of one of these people that keep these lists. And I was struck by one of them by the great writer Elmore Leonard, who's possibly the greatest Detroit crime writer of all time. And so I felt like I really need to listen to this guy, because he's written so many immense books about Detroit. And I'm embarking, here I am, a wee guy from Perth in Scotland, embarking, writing about Detroit, a city I've visited numerous times, but I've never really been from or whatever. And his first rule was never start a book with the weather, right? Unfortunately, on the first day of January 1967, Detroit was beset by the worst snowstorm in the city's history. And I was kind of slightly trapped in there thinking, I have to disobey Elmer Leonard and place the central character of Berry Gordy, who owned Motown, trapped inside his home in Monica in northwest Detroit. And the purpose of doing that was to some extent also to set out the narrative that was unfolding over the 12 months. And the book is structured actually quite clearly around the 12 months of the year, January through to December, and it was very fortunate that it was a year so rich in stories that I had to almost kind of break it down into the layers of narrative, if you like, that were going through the book. And that's one of the things that I've carried forward with Memphis, because the central character in all the books is the city itself. It is the dominant character in Detroit and the dominant character now in Memphis 68. But then there's other characters that kind of layer through the book that give you the big storylines of the time. And of course, Memphis 68 is framed by two major characters and two significant deaths. The death in the last days of 1967 of Otis Redding, who's killed in a plane crash in Wisconsin, and of course his death looms large over the city for the following year, because Stax Records, the main independent within Memphis at the time, has effectively lost their most kind of successful and most profitable singer, their star, the person that's given them kind of global purpose and whatever. So that's a significant kind of moment in it. But of course, by the 4th of April 1968, the most famous civil rights activist in the world, Martin Luther King, is assassinated in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel in an incident that kind of not only sparked urban unrest across the urban areas of the USA, but has become a kind of landmark moment in the history of African American, in the story of African American struggle or progress or whatever. And so the book navigates these two major events. But one of the things I'd kind of set myself, which again is a carryover from the style of the first book, is to try to look at the stories, some of which are already well-known stories. Martin Luther King's story is, of course, historically famous. 50th anniversary will be coming up next year in April, and the media will again revisit that story and all the kind of doubts that surround it. And I wanted to try and do something slightly different, which was to see the story through the prism of relatively what society or history would deem as being relatively unimportant people who are viewing it from their perspective, who are witnesses to it, and who are not necessarily likely to be famous people in history. And I think it's a technique that served me well in Detroit, where I was actually looking at people from the ground up and trying to kind of see how the city impacted on obscure soul singers or ordinary people, or people that are caught up in the social disturbances of the time or whatever, people whose lives were being ruined by the deindustrialization of the city or whatever. And for that reason, I think there are as much books about social change as there are books about soul music. You know, although soul music is the love affair that took me to the books, they're very much books about history as well. So with that in mind, let me introduce you to the city itself, and to particularly the street that's most famous, musical street in Memphis, which is Beale Street, which runs through the old downtown area. And one of the people that I was most fascinated by was a gentleman known as Roosevelt Jameson. Now, Roosevelt Jameson is a soul producer. He's not hugely famous, but he had in his catalogue of artists that he produced a number of the great southern soul singers of the era, James Carr, O.V. Wright, and the group The Ovations. None of them were hugely successful, and certainly not hugely successful under his tutelage, and so he was never really a man that made much money from soul music. But the profession that he had, which is really what fascinated me about him, was that he owned a blood bank, right? And it was a blood bank in the centre of Beale Street during a period of time when blood was in effect still a segregated commodity, that if you were black you would go into one blood bank, if you were white you would go into another blood bank in a different part of the city. And that gave me an opportunity to talk about Memphis and the peak era of segregation that was supposedly coming out of through the eyes of a sole producer who owned a blood bank. Just to give you a kind of perspective here, the first significant event of 1968 in Memphis happens 2 minutes in to the new year, where Memphis has voted in and is now signing in a new mayor. The mayor goes by the name of Henry Loeb, and he's from a family that own laundrettes across the whole of Memphis. But intriguingly, this guy, who's effectively a white racist from the south, has made the decision that what he wants to do is to reverse the human rights and civil rights progresses that Martin Luther King had fought for. In other words, he wants to take Memphis back to the 1920s, and his presence as a mayor is part of a kind of series of kind of connected political decisions that leads ultimately to the assassination of Martin Luther King. So I'll start off on the 1st of January 1968. Generosity oozed from the pores of Roosevelt Jameson. He was a kind man, easy to like, and surprisingly for a man raised in the nefarious ways of Memphis soul music, he knew all there was to know about blood plasma. Jameson had a kind word for everyone, even the drifters who hung around his doorway, and he wished the world a good new year as he navigated his way through the early morning debris of Beale Street in Memphis on January the 1st, bypassing the drunks, the panhandlers, and the torn ticker tape from the night before. A small pack of dogs was scavenging from overturned garbage cans, and nothing about the first day of 1968 hinted at the dramas to come. It was a new year, but the old ways clung on in Memphis. The city was reluctantly negotiating racial integration. A school bus programme was underway. New legislation was set to challenge decades of segregation in the housing market. But despite all of the progress of the years of civil rights, the most basic commodity of human life, blood, was still stubbornly racist. Jameson knew it, and he knew it for a fact. This was his business. He ran the Interstate Blood Bank, which sat on the bustling corner of Beale Street and South 4th Street, at the intersection near the First Baptist Church of Memphis and the New Daisy Theatre, between the Lord and late night entertainment. Beale Street was the pumping artery of black Memphis life. Its legacy reached back to the blues singers of the Great Depression, and it still had a reputation for attracting the iridescent creatures of the night. It was a street where the first zoot suit was tailored, and among its many inhabitants were the Stax singer Rufus Thomas, who had worked as a teenage MC at the Regal Theatre in Beale Street when he was a member of the boisterous Rabbit Foot Minstrels. Thomas had once said, "If you were black for one Saturday night on Beale Street, you'd never want to be white again." By 1968, Jameson had invested much of his time and money in soul music, but it proved a fickle and cruel companion. He'd lost the best of his singers to Goldwax Records and to other local independents, and all he had left in the whole wide world was blood, red, gushing, and plentiful. If you bear with me, I'll just jump forward. The chapter ends with the evenings would bring Jameson full circle back to Beale Street as he travelled Memphis. This was the busiest time of his working day, when the singers and musicians arrived from their day jobs and rehearsals would begin. It was also the time that regular donors, many from Baptist churches across the city, finished their work for the day and would take time out to donate, and when alcoholics would turn up needing a few cents for drinks. Jameson had been told by the university that he worked for not to take blood from drunks for fear of contamination, and he tried to stick scrupulously to the rules, but witnessing the broken lives and gone faces around him tested his deeply held Christian views. So he kept a small jar of quarters under the desk to give out to the most needy. Generosity oozed from the pores of Roosevelt Jameson, but charity alone could not solve the problems of Memphis. Powerful forces were gathering outside the Interstate Blood Bank, and they came with a mandate to challenge the deep discrimination that still lingered in the city. Within a matter of months, the decaying corners of Beale Street would be visited by righteous fury, pathological racism, and unprecedented grief. So that's the kind of first chapter, introducing you to a man who otherwise would be virtually unknown to history, but I think is a really good witness to the city and to its various ways. But of course, the most famous man of all in terms of the music scene in Memphis, Otis Redding, has passed away. That's triggered a significant period of grieving within the first 2 months of the year, because not only had he died, but many of his backing musicians, the Barkeys, who were a small Memphis group, had also died with them. And that takes us to a second short reading that I'll do, which is called Carl Cunningham's Cardboard Requiem. It's the 8th of January now, in the same year, and it starts outside the offices of Stax Records in Memphis. It was a routine delivery. A parcel truck parked illegally outside a dilapidated cinema on East Macklemore Avenue in South Memphis. No one even looked at the driver as he stacked a tower of cardboard boxes and delivered them to the foyer to the ramshackle offices of one of the most prodigious independent recording studios in the world. This was Stax Records, the flagship home of Memphis soul, and a beacon of hope for hundreds of young musicians and teenagers who hung around its doors as if it were a fairground. The boxes were addressed only to the company, and they lay by the entrance unacknowledged for several days. It was only when a curious staff member opened them that their sad significance came to light. They contained the remains of the drum kit of Carl Lee Cunningham, the deceased drummer of the Barkeys, the backing band of Stax's most famous star, Otis Redding. The cardboard lay scattered over the lavender carpeting, a banal requiem to the tragic events of the previous month, when 7 young people plunged to their death in a plane crash. The drum cases were in a bad state, battered by the waves, rusted by cold waters, with their skins partly torn from the rims. The red strips of tape that once secured the cases top to bottom had peeled off in the deep and now hung pathetically down. Carl Cunningham's death hurt Stax to the core. He was a familiar face around the studios, a boy obsessed with music and bewitched by the beat, who came from a famous family of drummers well known at Stax and on the streets of Orange Mound where he'd grown up. Like many of his generation, he lived a hand-to-mouth existence, holding down low-paid jobs as a shoeshine boy at King's Barber Shop in the corner of College Street and East Macklemore. Cunningham's drums were the last items to be salvaged from the crash site. His horn-rimmed glasses had disappeared, and the drumsticks he'd cradled in his hand as the plane plummeted down were never recovered. They were presumed lost in the frozen waters of Lake Monona in Dane County, Wisconsin. Talking to the press about the deaths was a tough thing to ask anyone to do, and that role fell heavily on the shoulders of Cunningham's best friend, the trumpeter Ben Colley, who was still only 20-year-old. He'd been hospitalised in the immediate aftermath of the crash and had spent a difficult Christmas recuperating. Now that 1968 had arrived, he was facing up to the loss of his best friends. He stood in the reception area at Stax, head bowed down in grief and holding back the tears, barely managing to answer the questions in a stammering, fading voice as journalists probed him for more details. He was dressed in a double-breasted military raincoat with epaulettes and a Ushanka hat that perched perilously on his head and looked as if he'd bought it second-hand from the Russian army. It was in fact a hat that he'd bought in Wisconsin as the winter winds grew stronger before he'd boarded the plane. On his left arm he wore a new wristwatch to replace the one he lost in the deep waters, and then Ben held his hands in front of him as if he were at a wake, and his eyes gazed wearily at the floor. He started to explain his ordeal. He had all but passed out in the freezing lake, but miraculously had managed to survive by clinging on to a soaking wet seat cushion. Hallucinating with hypothermia, he'd watched each of his friends try to escape from the wreckage, but fail to keep their heads above water, all drowned before him and before the rescue party had arrived. Ben Colley spent 25 minutes in the water, and when he could no longer hold on to the sodden cushion in his numb and frozen hands any longer, he drifted into unconsciousness. Quote, "Just as soon as I let it go, somebody yanked me up," Colley remembered, still bewildered by the randomness that had saved his life and killed all of his friends. He admitted to the journalists that his near drowning provoked recurring nightmares in which, quote, "the rush of the lake's icy water, the chill of fear, and the helplessness lapped through his mind, now and probably forever." And so, again, you know, the approach here is to, rather than focus on Otis Redding and his historic death, looking at the people that were either dying with him or the people, in this case, in Ben Colley's case, had survived. But as the social story emerges, I'll not read this, I'll summarise it because reading it is actually quite intense. There's quite a lot of kind of pain in the reading of it as well. But in the February of 1968, Memphis is going through a period where, in fact, quite a lot of the months in Memphis where there are sudden, unpredictable monsoon downpours of rain. You know, really, really hot, but then rains descending. At the time, the Memphis sanitation workers were going through a period of unionisation, and there had been a number of strikes around safety and around working practices, which the new mayor was trying to reverse, and was insistent that the sanitation workers worked conditions that were segregated effectively. Now, the reality of the situation is that the pay was so poor, the jobs so filthy and so demeaning, that the only people that had ever worked in the sanitation department in Memphis in the role of cleaning the streets were young black men, many of whom were poorly educated, and some of them, including O.V. Wright, the singer, who were addicted to, in his case, heroin or to alcohol or whatever. So it's kind of the most pathetic end, really, of the social services chain of work within Memphis. And on one of the days, two young men, their names were Echo Cole and Robert Walker, were caught in a thunderstorm, and the only way that they could shelter from it was to jump into the back of the truck, which is called a Viner barrel truck, which were old kind of metallic trucks used in Memphis at the time. Unfortunately, when they were sheltering in the back of the truck, there was an electrical failure and the truck impacted and the motor spun round, chewing them both to death and killing the two men pretty much instantly. It was effectively the last straw for the union, and the death of these two men triggered a strike that was to actually last for many, many months throughout 1968. And significantly, it was that strike that diverted Martin Luther King to Memphis to come and support the strike. He, just to give you a bit of context here, was going through quite significant kind of rethinking about where the civil rights movement would go next. Great victories had been won. There had been the end of discrimination within the education system, at least in terms of the Supreme Court. There was an open housing legislation, so technically the end of discrimination in housing as well. So great victories for the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King believed that they had to look on to the next phase of their development. He'd made a very, very infamous speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, in the April 1967, which had kind of alienated him from some of the political mainstream in America, and particularly had alienated him from J. Edgar Hoover, the notorious director of the FBI, who had this kind of pathological hatred of Martin Luther King. But King had another thought, and it's quite an interesting one. He'd gone with some of his colleagues to visit a school program in the Deep South, and he'd come across a group of kids who had no food during the day. They were studying and they were in this kind of poor schoolroom, but were not fed. There was no school dinners, there was certainly no free school dinners, and so therefore they went through the entire day unfed. And he had said at the time, the next part of the movement can't just be about civil rights. It can no longer be about our right to sit at a Woolworth store and next to a white person or whatever. This has to be about how civil rights and poverty interface with each other. And in some respects, notwithstanding the fact that we were seeing also the emergence of the Black Power movement, whatever, it was that thought of linking civil rights to poverty that to some extent radicalised Martin Luther King for the next phase of his movement and made him even more dangerous in the eyes of the mainstream in America. He then said that he would support the strike and would come to Memphis to march on behalf of the sanitation workers and the two dead men, and that brought him to Memphis for two marches, one which had become a quite disputational march where there had been some violence in the streets and where the mainstream media, if you like, were trying to portray Martin Luther King as now being a violent activist rather than, a pacifist or a non-violent demonstrator. all of that said, he arrived, and of course, infamously was shot in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel, which itself, as you read the book, is a character in the book, because the Lorraine Motel was the only black-owned motel in Memphis. It had been a hugely important motel for the passage of people that were coming through the city to perform at local theatres or in the soul clubs or whatever. But significantly, it was a place that Stax used as a kind of spillover place. So particularly Isaac Hayes and David Porter would hire a room there during the day and go there to write, to get away from the noise of the studio or whatever. And some of soul music's great records were actually composed or written, the lyrics written in the motel itself. Mabel John, who's a Detroit singer who by this time signed for Stax, she was the sister of Little Willie John, the R&B singer. She had almost a permanent room in the motel, and in fact, again, kind of ironically, the management had asked her to vacate the room to allow Martin Luther King to have what was his favourite room, room 306, which Mabel John had been staying in semi-permanently. So she moved out, she took her cases, moved to another room, and Martin Luther King moved in. So the motel has this really kind of fascinating kind of story of its own to tell. On the day of the evening, really, of the 2nd March, where the Memphis authorities were trying to block the march, Martin Luther King's team, legal team, were fighting the injunction in the courts. He was back in his room around kind of the late afternoon of the day of his death, and they were trying that night to have a fundraiser elsewhere. It was actually at a northern part of Detroit, at an old union hall around Firestone, the tire company's trade union hall, and that concert fundraiser was going to be one of the kind of big ways of raising both awareness and money. And it was the case that a very famous Memphis saxophonist, Ben Branch, was going to be the star attraction on the night of the fundraiser. Ben Branch was one of two big bands that dominated Memphis live soul music over the 50s and 60s, the other being Willie Mitchell of High Records. And the two of them were kind of always vied for the best musicians. It was quite funny actually, but Ben Branch, along with some other musicians at the time, resented anyone who couldn't read music. They didn't mind that it was fine if people wanted to go and play for other bands, but unless you could read music, you couldn't be in his band. And so famously, he sacked Isaac Hayes for not being able to do sight reading and music at that time and whatever. So he was a great character and a saxophonist who, in the aftermath of King's death, moved to Chicago, where he joined with Jesse Jackson what was called the Operation Breadbasket Choir. That was the famous civil rights post Martin Luther King, the famous, if you like, soul orchestra that toured with Jesse Jackson. It was mostly Chicago based. But on the day of the assassination, Ben Branch went into the car park outside the Lorraine Motel and started to speak to Martin Luther King, who was on the balcony of the motel. And he shouted down and said to him, Ben, what are you going to play tonight? And there was a particular gospel record that was amongst Martin Luther King's favourites. And he said, Ben, you've got to play it for me. Play it sweeter than you've ever played it before. Bang. And the bullet hit Martin Luther King on the throat and killed him nearly instantly. He died an hour later in a downtown Memphis hospital, John Gaston Hospital. So the last person to speak to Martin Luther King was the saxophonist Ben Branch, who was on his way to do a fundraiser for the civil rights movement. And in lots of ways, his story, the story of him interweaving with King, gives you witness to his to King's death. But I'll just jump forward to two more chapters, because it wouldn't be a true book about soul music and social change were there not a conspiracy in the middle of it. And we do love our conspiracy, every one of us. In this particular one, it's the 4th of April, it's late afternoon, and a young man who has arrived in Memphis only, I think, about 12 weeks before, a gentleman by the name of Morel McCulloch, who's come back from Vietnam. He's part of the airborne 11th Military Airborne Unit, who've placed him as an undercover military intelligence officer with the Memphis Police Department. So he's just come back from Vietnam, he's from military intelligence, and he's been put into the MPD, where he's infiltrated a Black Power organisation within Memphis. Now, we tend now to think of Black Power to do with the Panthers and assume that they are the kind of dominant force in kind of insurrectionist black militancy, but each city had its own different organisation. Some of them were Panthers, many of them were not. So in Chicago it was the Blackstone Rangers. In Memphis they were called the Memphis Invaders, and they were the absolute Black Power organisation within Memphis at the time. And what's wonderful, particularly if you're a kind of obsessive Northern Soul fan, is one of the leading members of the Memphis Invaders is a great soul singer called John Gary Williams, the lead singer of the Mad Lads, who's got a couple of extremely rare and tasty records out there as we speak, but I'll not get diverted into their value or their worth, because he, on the day, his organisation has been infiltrated effectively by military intelligence. And isn't it a huge coincidence that immediately on the death of Martin Luther King, as his crumpled body lies on the balcony, and there's a photograph of it within the book, the person who's next to him cradling his head is an undercover police officer who's been sent by military intelligence. I mean, in America you could not make it up. The first person to reach the slain body of Martin Luther King was neither a member of his staff nor a Mattel employee. And he was a man who had many, many reasons not to be caught in the headlights of history. Agent 500, a 24-year-old African-American secret agent, colloquially known as Max, was at the time working as an undercover agent for the Memphis Police Department on attachment from US military intelligence. Agent 500 grabbed a towel from a nearby laundry basket and tried to stem the gush of blood from King's neck. Two young girls from a gospel choir who'd gone towards King's room in the hope of getting an autograph stood frozen in shock at the sight of the crumpled body sprawled in front of them. Within seconds, King's closest aides had rushed to the scene, and Agent 500 had vanished, taking off down the stairway and out through the courtyard, hidden by the chaos. Ralph Abernathy, who'd been in the bathroom of room 306, slapping on aftershave in his face when he heard the shot, Andrew Young, the SCLC's executive director, had arrived at the scene after his day of intense courtroom wrangling to secure the rights for another march. And Hosea Williams, another executive, was with him. Jesse Jackson, then King's man in Chicago, was nearby, already climbing the external stairs. In another room, the scattered clothes of Detroit soul singer Mabel John, then recording an album track at the Stax Studios. She'd since claimed that she'd been asked to vacate the fated room 306 at the request of the management to allow King to have his favourite room. It was just one of a number of innumerable claims, counterclaims and coincidences that surrounded the shooting. Either conscious of the status of those gathering around the dying King, or more likely anxious about his visibility at the scene of the assassination, Agent 500 handed the now blood-soaked towel to Abernathy, shielded the two young girls from the trauma of the dying man, and quietly faded into the background. What's absolutely fascinating about what he does next remains one of the kind of great mysteries of the American assassination culture, and that is that Agent 500, Morel McCulloch, crossed the car park of the Mattel and headed over to a little kind of cafe bar called Jim's Grill on Main Street in Memphis, where strangely he had a meeting with three Memphis policemen, all of them white, two of them from the Memphis Police is Rifle Club, and amongst the two most successful armed killers of the Memphis Police. That leaves you with the thought about, oh my God, what was really going on in that day? Above Jim's Grill was the supposed assassin who had found his way there after pursuing Martin Luther King over a period of a year. Now, the motivations for James L. Ray, the supposed killer, to be there was that his brother owned a bar in where exactly was it? St. Louis, Missouri, and he was a supporter of right-wing organisations in St. Louis, but also across the south. It was actually, it opened the bar as a Ku Klux Klan bar, and in the bar, the brother of the assassin had put up a bounty for anyone who would murder Martin Luther King. So you have this kind of cesspit of different things going on. And I'll just leave you with the last thought in your mind. It's now the settled conclusion that it was a lone gunman, James Earl Ray, a racist criminal from Alton, Illinois, who killed Martin Luther King. Ray had escaped from the Missouri State Penitentiary in April, and in a bizarre journey across America snaked his way to Memphis, where he fired the fatal shot. But like the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X, the conspiracy theories have yet to subside, and if they have even the thinnest vestige of credibility, then officers from the Memphis Police Department, agents of the FBI, and shady operatives from military intelligence colluded in the killing. In that murky scenario, Morel McCulloch, Agent 500, had a front row seat at history. So a lot of people have said to me, what do you think really happened? And I have to be brutally honest and say I don't know, but I suspect that too many things were congregating on that day that remain unexplained for it to be simply a murder by a lone nutter. So a wee bit like the John F. Kennedy killing, it's one of those things that the state has never fully explained. And to this day, actually, one of the men who's still alive, one of the men that was in Jim's Grill on that day, Martin Luther King's widow and his children have taken out private prosecutions against him, trying to frame him as one of the kind of in a conspiracy to kill King. So it's something that I can't ever come up with the answer to, but read the book because it does make you begin to wonder about what exactly did go on, and the research I've done into it, some of which I've had to take from Memphis Police Department files and from whatever, and from the Freedom of Information files at the FBI and whatever, tell of a story that's fascinating beyond belief. And that leads me to the Black Power organisation, the Memphis Invaders, who, as I mentioned earlier, I'd kind of fallen in love with, in part because, well, I suppose as a white guy from Scotland, you slightly imagine that you'll be a Black Panther one day. But the real reason is that the singer John Gary Williams is one of my favourite singers. I had a bit of a moral dilemma about the book because when I was doing research at the Memphis Police Department offices, I came across the arrest photograph of John Gary Williams when he was arrested in an incident featuring the Memphis Invaders, a Black Power insurrection shootout with the Memphis police. And I thought, wow, this is the best photograph ever. This is the photograph that proves it all. It connects Northern Soul to radical politics, and I was so excited by it. And then I thought to myself, oh my God, John Gary is still alive. He's 75-year-old. He's rediscovered his faith and runs a gospel group in Memphis. He's a friend of mine on Facebook. I can't possibly say to him, John, guess what? Great news, I found your arrest photographs. So I actually put in the arrest photographs of one of his mates, who's now dead. Right, so that's how it goes. And he's brilliant. It was a great photo as well. But once the book's out in America, I'm sending a copy to John Gary, and I'll say to him I found it, and if he wants it for his posterity, I'll send it to him. But the story is going to, if I can just do a little brief personal story from my life, it helps you understand the way in which I sometimes think when I'm working. It's called Sonny Yancey's New Job, and it's about a young guy called Edward. Sonny's his nickname, Sonny Yancey. When I was a young bad boy, as a kid growing up, I was a skinhead back in Scotland, and there had been this, remarkably and in their kind of madness, the Scottish Football Association had allowed football league games to take place on Christmas Day. Right? And as luck would have it, or as bad luck would have it, the team that I support, St Johnstone, drew a game against Dundee, their local rivals, and it was the height of football hooliganism. You just knew it was going to be chaos, right? And sure enough, all forms of madness erupted on the streets that day, and I had to take off. Basically they blocked a street off with police dogs or whatever, and I had to run through this house. All I remember is the only way to escape is run through a house. I ran through this house, and here were this families sitting eating their Christmas dinner with a wee paper hats on, bolt through, my mates followed me, we're over this wall and away. But the police had watched all of the people and knew who it was long before CCTV. They just knew who the local bad boys were, and they'd arrested 3 guys from the team that I supported, and I knew that they were absolute pathological nutters, right? And I'll have to be brutally honest, to this day, they were like, if you've ever seen Trainspotting, they were Begbie. You know, they were the local Begbies. They were just psychopaths. And I was more frightened of them than I was of the police. And always remember in my mind, when they came round to my house for me to be a witness, I was deeply reluctant. I mean, I was at things like, oh, I saw nothing. You'll notice I've got very bad eyesight. I was trying anything other than dobbing these guys in it because I knew that it was going to be bad for me. And so as I wrote this chapter, much of that was in my mind, although it's nothing to do with it, and it's nothing to do with Scotland, it's nothing to do with football. It's about Memphis in '68, and it's called Sonny Yancey's New Job. Sonny Yancey cursed the day he took a shortcut home from work, and every time he told the story it was with anxiety in his voice. Even his own mother was not sure if he was telling her the whole truth. Edward W. Sonny Yancey was only 18, and unlike many of his friends, he'd not been conscripted. Against all the odds, he'd found a good job too. It wasn't the best paid job in Memphis, but he was now a kitchen porter at top of the 100 Club, a fashionable skyline restaurant at 100 North Main Street. 37 stories up in the air overlooking the riverfront. I love the fact that it was called the top of the 100 Club, that another connection to Northern Soul, but that's another matter. It was one of these there was one of 3 revolving restaurants in Memphis at the time, but Yancey was sure that this one was the best. He'd seen Elvis eating there, and he'd coming back from the service elevator, he'd passed Isaac Hayes, who regularly came in and sat at his own private table wearing sunglasses. The kitchen staff, who were almost all black, were discouraged from looking at the guests and were only ever allowed to use the service elevator. They were forbidden to enter the Japanese Gardens, a decorative retreat at the rear of the restaurant where lawyers and their clients met discreetly to discuss business. The rules were strict, but it was a job that came with a hint of glamour, even though his job was to actually gut chickens, carry waste to the elevator and peel onions through smarting eyes. The night that Sonny Yancey took a shortcut home was the 24th of August 1968. He'd come off a long Saturday night in the kitchens and he'd gone over the story with police detectives in a gruelling 8-hour interrogation. They'd not read him his rights, and he'd spent most of the time fearful for his job as they pounded him with questions demanding greater detail and even more corroboration. For a time they even told him he was a suspect. There had been a spate of attacks on police vehicles and a police officer had been shot. Yancey was in the area at the time and was questioned soon after. He'd seen the suspects and it preyed on his mind like a secret he wished he'd never been told. For the first time in his young life, he felt pressurised into assisting a police force he had no good reason to respect. It was approximately 10:30 p.m. when he headed home to his mother's house on Castick Street. En route, he noticed 4 people crouching by high weeds on an embankment on Devant Avenue where it dips down to the Yazoo railroad track. It was an area steeped in the past. The old bluesman called the rail track the Yellow Dog and paid tribute to it in song and in story. But for boys of Yancey's age, it was no more than a shortcut home through the scattered single-storey wooden frame houses, the rusting fences and the deserted freight yards. Yancey was nearly home when he spotted the 4 men. He knew one of them as Speedy, the nickname for a 19-year-old local youth called Womack Stevenson, and he knew that the other was the singer, John Gary Williams of the soul group The Mad Lads. He'd once dated Sonny's sister. He had no idea who the other 2 were, but he suspected they were members of the Memphis Invaders. They were Ree Mackenzie, 18, and Ben Berry, also 18, both of whom were already known to the police and had been arrested for participating in a riot at the city's Carver High School earlier in the years. The Invaders' notoriety had grown since the sanitation workers' strike. They had tentacles that reached further than a street gang and an organisational depth that dug deep into the poverty programmes and ghetto streets of South Memphis. The Invaders were feared but also respected. Since the assassination of Martin Luther King, they'd armed themselves and spoke openly of insurrection. But like the Black Panthers, their activities mostly involved poverty outreach and black educational projects. The Memphis police were their sworn enemy, and the police were distrusted by almost every black family in the city. a predominantly white force who'd attacked demonstrators during the strike and had acted at best incompetently in the case of the murder of Martin Luther King, the Memphis Police Department had been slow to recruit young blacks and alienated even the most compliant youths with heavy-handed tactics and discriminatory stop-and-search procedures. In many areas, particularly in the south of the city, they were seen as an occupying army, patrolling neighbourhoods aggressively in their numbered tactical squad cars. So as the story unfolds and the court case unfolds over the next 3 months, the Memphis invaders are all eventually jailed. And one of them, John Gary Williams, goes off to jail where he writes the lyrics and the kind of rhythms of an album that's just simply called John Gary Williams. One of the tracks of which is an utterly brilliant track called The Whole Damn World Is Going Crazy, which is kind of like influenced by Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, but it's the kind of way in which he looks at the streets of Memphis in much the way that Marvin Gaye's track looks at the streets of Detroit. So if you've not heard it, go on to YouTube and pick it up. Absolutely brilliant. And with all of that, I'm going to have to come to an end because we've reached our time. And can I just thank you very much for being an attentive audience and listening to me. Thank you very, very much indeed. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
We've got plenty of time for questions, contributions. I can't see people around the corner, so you're going to have to wave at me wildly. So if I've got a few people, I might take a couple at a time. I'll see how it goes. Yep, Alan, right back.
Yeah, I've read the book. It's absolutely fabulous.
Can I quote you on that?
You can, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned gave a lot of mention to the Memphis invaders. Do you know that? Are you aware that they've made a film about them?
Yes, I saw that there's a crowdfunder stage where they were starting to crowdfund it, and I saw the trailer for it. Yeah. I've not actually seen the film itself yet. Have you seen it?
Yeah, they had I was in New York earlier on in the year, and they had a rough cut showing.
Yeah.
And they had a question and answer after with John B.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was saying that the next year, the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out.
Yeah.
That may tie up some of the loose ends that you were alluding to.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, not least of which I think that more journalistic focus will be put on it. And the idea now that you can turn around and say, well, it was coincidence that, you know, military officers. I mean, some of the things that went on. The interesting thing was right opposite Lorraine Mattel, there's a fire station, probably the biggest fire station in downtown Memphis, and at the time there were only 2 black officers. On the morning of King's death, both black officers were put to outlying fire stations in the periphery of the city for no good reason. There was no rationale. They'd not been told in advance or whatever. They were just told, today you're going there and you're going there. One of them had actually been a strike supporter. Although he's a fireman, he'd raised funds for the sanitation workers' strike and whatever. And it's clear that his management, somewhere up the chain of command, either influenced by the police or put pressure on by military security, military intelligence, felt that this man was too close to King or too close to the cause to be there on the day. So they just simply got rid of him. I mean, all things unexplained. I mean, when you see the explanations, you think, really? On the day, you took the only 2 black officers and moved them with no notice on the morning of the man's assassination. You know, it's extraordinary, you know. So I think a lot of stuff's going to come out that, and the family are determined still. I mean, we're going down to the sons now, particularly, are determined that they actually get some clear explanation, because unlike John F. Kennedy's assassination, it doesn't involve necessarily Cuba or Russia or anything like that. All of this happened within the USA and within a single city, you know.
And didn't they had Senate hearings or?
Yeah, they had.
But they haven't been made public, have they?
Well, funnily enough, Yo is the answer to that. You can get abridged versions of them, and I got them actually. It was strangely enough, it was in the University of Memphis library that had a copy of them, And Morel McCulloch actually gives some testimony. They ask him, why were you there, what were you doing, whatever. He slightly kind of fudges it by saying that he was a Memphis police officer and ignores the fact that he was in the military intelligence from Airborne 111, they were called, the squad that he was a member of. So he's not, he's economical with the truth, even under oath, you know. So a lot of that, a lot of the kind of testimony has yet to be fully made public, and some of it was kind of redacted, the way that they often are. But I suspect the pressure on that redacting will get greater this year, you know.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you, does John Gary Williams, is he embarrassed about his past?
I think not, because he's contributed to the movie, and I think that he's one of the people that says, look, you know, I was there, this was me. He'd served in Vietnam, he'd come back, he met John Burrell Smith, the guy that you mentioned earlier, who was a kind of young black Marxist who'd actually had been to meet Fidel Castro earlier in the 60s as part of that famous period where I think there was a whole group of quite famous young black radicals from all over the States went to Cuba, and he had been one of them, and he'd been a big influence on John Gary Williams. And John Gary Williams, certainly when I've spoken to him, sees it as being the context of the time. Now, I think he may have different views now, but remember, you know, he puts forward the argument that says, look, you know, the American Constitution secures the right to bear arms, not the right to bear arms for white people, you know, and so he would claim that at that time they were arming because it was a constitutional right, and a lot of black people were being killed, as we know from Black Lives Matter. That still happens. My own view is that you know, he's returned to his Christian faith. He may have different arguments now, but he was pretty clear at the time that they were an armed insurrectionist group like the Black Panthers. There was no shame about that.
So the photograph that you have,
Yeah.
is that the photograph of his arrest because he was a member of the Memphis Invaders?
Correct, yeah.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit, because I think that's something to, you know, of honour.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.